It's the Misfits.
Hey everybody, welcome back. It's Mr. Misfits, it's season 3, and we already have to separate. We're only 2 episodes in.
We lasted a whole whopping 2 episodes before having to separate again, so
Yes,
some things never change.
Yeah, so Sunday was Easter, so, happy resurrection, everybody. But on Good Friday, I woke up with the flu. And am almost done recovering as we're recording this on Monday night. So we figured it's best to not spread germs and instead, spread the right message. So we're separated again.
I like that. That's a lot better.
You like that? Yeah, that was just right off the top of my head here. But if you did catch what we did do this weekend, is that I did get to sit down with our good friend Joe Day over at Buddy Walk. And he and I did our suddenly now a tradition that we didn't realize we were starting because, we both talk about how we hate traditions. But we started one accidentally of he and I getting together and walking through different holidays together as to in how it applies. So if you haven't checked it out, go back and look at the Buddy Walk through of Holy Week. Get it, Buddy Walk through Holy Week? Yeah. That one is good? No? Okay. I'm not getting any response from Brandon, so I guess
that was sorry.
Yeah,
that was
but yeah,
that was the internet problem. So it wasn't a bad joke.
Oh yeah, yeah, sure. Blame the internet. But yeah, go back and look through a Buddy Walk through Holy Week, where Joe and I walk through the different days of Holy Week. We look at it in the Bible. We look at it in terms of what it means for us today, as well as what it does not mean for us today. That sometimes we like to hear. So go look at that. Today, though, episode 2, a couple other updates. The updates I talked about in week 1 still are not up yet because I got sick. So there are still some updates coming to the website, so stay tuned for that. The guest portals are going to look much nicer and easier to navigate once I actually get it done. The merch is coming. Again, technology this time. I'll blame technology because Printful was not letting me upload the images when I needed to. So we're working on all of that. It'll be up here very, very soon, very shortly. We're also still doing the Bible study. If you want to join the Bible study, you still can. We're going into week 6, I believe, and into chapter 4 this week. So if you want to join that, patreon.com/Mr. Misfits. We're walking through the book of Galatians. We're in chapter 4. And, I think it's been fun. Don't know if anybody else has been thinking it's fun. I think it's been fun.
Yeah, I think it's been good, and we've been going through it a little bit slower than we had originally planned, but there's a lot of different sections to go through, and we're not in a time rush. So
yes, we are in no rush.
It the due diligence. Yeah.
Yes. So stay tuned for that. They had been dropping today if you're listening on Tuesday, but because we're now back to normal operating hours, we are releasing them on Thursday. So if you're wondering where the episodes are Tuesday morning, it's because of this. So stay tuned. They're going to hit Patreon on Tuesday. The study guides are still going to be available Tuesday or Wednesday night, depending on if I get it uploaded in time. So all that's going on. But today we are on episode 2. And we are separated but together in spirit.
That's right.
Because we kind of need a little bit of support to be able to talk about today's topic.
Do we need financial support?
Well, we do. Patreon.com/Ministry Misfits. It's still there. But no, this is a topic that gets either overused or underused due to the nature of the emotions that it brings about. Either you have people that push it so much and they're not afraid to push it so much because of the fact that they are not doing it correctly. Or you have people that are afraid to actually preach about this or talk about this because of how it looks. And we are talking today about money.
Yeah, I was going to say, besides politics and religion, I would say this is probably number 3 of the thing
Right.
that you just don't typically talk about in a day-to-day conversation. And like you said, from the pulpit, it can get a little dicey at times.
Yes, because in reality, money incorporates both politics and religion most of the time.
Hmm.
So we are talking today about what biblical giving actually is. And the reason we're talking about this is not so that you go and support us. We're talking about this because over the past couple weeks, there's been quite a few interesting takes on what biblical giving actually is. And there's a bee flying around in here. Hang on. Where did it go?
Our special guest.
Yeah.
Maybe this is the next episode of Ant-Man
Yeah.
and the Wasp.
Apparently, I'm not alone in studio today. All right. Well, we'll keep going and just see how this goes. All right.
We'll
So,
find out if you're allergic or not.
yeah, guess. Well, this will be a very interesting episode. But yeah, we're talking about biblical giving. If that wasn't interesting enough, we're talking about money. So, biblical giving, what it is, what it's not, because there's a lot of bad takes on this. And there's a lot of good takes on this that people are afraid to actually do because of the fact that most people assume if you're doing this as bad intentions.
Yeah, so you put a poll out for
Yeah.
everybody to kind of get an idea of how did you hear giving talked about in your churches, either growing up or probably even for some today.
Yes, and it got some interesting responses even in the comments because we had one person straight up say it was used as manipulation all the time, and so they just don't even want to talk about it. Others were like, well, it was kind of a combination of all of these. Some were like, we luckily have a pastor that never talks about it. That's not necessarily even what I was asking. And this is part of why we're doing this, is because as soon as money gets involved, intentions are always attached to what people want to go with.
Hmm.
What I actually was asking is, how do they refer to this? Do they call it tithes and offerings? Do they just refer to this as cheerful giving? Do they refer to this as gifts, or do they refer to this as donations? Those were the four options I gave. Now, tithes and offerings is coming out of Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Malachi, or where we get those names. 66% of people said that is how it's referred to. That's a pretty good majority.
Yeah, so that's our majority winner there.
Yes. Second place was referred to as cheerful giving, which comes out of 2 Corinthians 9. That was at 27%.
Okay.
And then gifts, which doesn't actually have a biblical application to it at all, got 5%. Donations, which obviously don't, has got 2%. Most people, when they hear about about it's time for giving within the church, it's referred to as tithes and offerings. Other times it's referred to with cheerful giving. Those are the two big ones, and those were the two I expected to be a lot. I almost didn't even put the other two down, but I figured it may end up 50-50, and that would be very annoying for us with our math. So we went with the four options. Biblical giving, though, is different than what we normally actually hear applied within our churches, and that's what we want to talk about today, is what biblical giving actually is. So to start with, we're going to actually look at biblical giving from an Old Testament standpoint. In the Old Testament, sacrifices and offerings were referred to as karbonah, and that means to draw near, which means that the sacrifices and the offerings intent was to bring somebody closer to God, or
Was
to
it the
whoever,
was it the individual or to bring somebody else?
to bring themselves. The person that
Okay.
was giving the sacrifice or giving the offering, the goal was to draw them nearer to God. That's the goal. Is you're bringing this offering to feel closer to them. But there were a lot of different ones, which, first off, that's a little bit different than we like to think of as well. Because normally when we talk about sacrifices and offerings and we're talking about drawing nearer to God, now we say we're talking what? The assumption is we're talking about
Sacrifice? I don't know.
prosperity gospel, right? You're just doing this so that to improve your relationship with God.
Yeah, it does sound like there's something in it for me. There's a gain.
It's about me, it's not about God. That's not what actually is being presented here within the Jewish tradition. That is not what's being presented. It sounds that way to us. A lot of it has to do with our understanding of salvation, as far as it's all about Jesus paying for the wrath of God. And so we don't do anything, Jesus does it all. And so sacrifice, offering, it's all about appeasing God's wrath. But what we actually have here within this idea of it bringing us closer when we are offering sacrifice and everything is that it is us trying to worship God
Hmm.
from a different perspective than some of these other ideas of worship. Little bit of a different idea. And again, it's about motivation.
Yes.
And that's a lot of what we're going to find as we walk through these. So there's a couple of different types of sacrifices and offerings that we find in the Old Testament. Most of these come out of Leviticus. Some come out of Deuteronomy. So the first one we have is Olah, which is the burnt offering. And this is one most of the time we think about when we think about sacrifices, when we talk Old Testament. You know, all those pictures we
More
had
the
in
animal.
right. The pictures that we had when growing up in Sunday school always had, the little smoke things coming off the cow, right? I mean, this is what we think about. You knew everybody that has grown up within evangelicalism knows exactly what picture I am talking about right there. I can guarantee everybody had the same picture just flash in their mind. The the burnt offerings, 100% of it was offered to God because it literally everything was burnt to a crisp. That was it. What was burnt was determined by your wealth. So if you were wealthy, you brought a bull. If you were poor, you brought what you could. That's different than, again, what we like to think about as well. We like to just think about something that's even and number, and there's not a lot of responsibility, I guess, put on those within our communities that have more. We don't expect them to give more than the lowly people.
Yeah. And was it typically their own animal that they were sacrificing, or if somebody was wealthy, would they bring in somebody else's bull?
Well, you wouldn't be able to bring in somebody else's stuff, but I mean, you would be able to, it wouldn't necessarily be your one that you've raised. It may be one that you've bought. That was the
Okay.
whole thing, Jesus with the money changers. The money changers were there because the Roman coins could not buy the animals for sacrifice. And so the money changers were there to trade it for a proper Jewish payment to pay for the animals to be sacrificed. They just were taking a much bigger cut than they were supposed to because they shouldn't have been taking any. That is what the whole flipping of tables was actually about. But it was because of this idea of the fact that they were offering the full portion to God. Then you have the Savak Shalamam, which I am not saying these right most likely, but that's what we're going with, which was the peace offering. And that was an offering that was shared between God, the priest, and the family that was doing the giving. And this was done as an act of thanksgiving and a thankfulness in the fact that God gave them free will, or the fact that it was in fulfillment of somebody's vows. Somebody has just accomplished what they had said they were going to. And so they would come, a portion of it would be given to God, a portion of it would be given to the priests, and a portion of it would the family would all share a meal there in the temple, thanking God for what had happened. Then you have the Shalah, or the sin offering. And now specifically, this one was done for an unintended sin. So this is something where you accidentally sinned, or it was a sin that you have committed. You are admitting you have committed it, which is different than what we're going to do next. So just hold on to that. What it was depended on what the sin was. If it was something small, it was a small sacrifice. If it was something major, it was a major sacrifice.
Now, who determined that?
The priest. And so the priest is the one that also the meat was taken, and that is what the priest actually used for their meals. Then you have the asham, which is the guilt offering. And this is one where you know you're guilty, but you don't know what for. You've been
Been
convicted,
there.
but you're not quite sure. And so you gave a guilt offering in place of the shalat until a judge or the community made a decision about whether or not you actually had committed the crime. If you had committed the sin, then you offered a shalat as well. And again, the meat was eaten by the priest, regardless of whether it was a guilt offering or a sin offering. This is part of how the priests got their meal. Then you also have an actual meal offering, which was like, I think it's called mincha. And again, half of it was burnt, and then the rest was shared among the priests. Then you had one that was undiluted wine, that was nasaka. It was poured at the altar and then drank by the priests. And then you have something, and this is one that's kind of interesting going on with what we just celebrated here this past weekend, is you have the para adama, and again, I'm probably not saying it correctly, but it's the red heifer. And the purpose of this one was that it purified the people from defilement caused from contact with the dead. You came in contact with somebody that had died, whether it was a relative and you buried, whether it was unintended, you accidentally came upon it, whatever the case may be, you have become ceremonially unclean because you have been in contact with something dead. And so you brought the red heifer to be sacrificed to cleanse you of that. But the thing that was interesting about this was that the one that performs the ritual, to the priest that would perform this to cause this person to become clean again, they themselves would become unclean because they now were in
So it's a
contact with a
constant
dead
circle.
animal. And it was a foreshadowing of what the Messiah would do. The Messiah would become unclean himself so that everyone else might be clean.
Mm.
Really cool to think about. And
It
this is
is.
something also to clarify also, the information I got came from a rabbi. The rabbis understand that this is supposed to be what the Messiah will be doing. Is
So
that he
again,
is
but
going to go ahead.
I was gonna say, so back to even the wealthy and unwealthy, would this have been something that more of the wealthy would have been able to partake in with the red heifer?
I think this one specifically is one that anybody would be able to do. Whether it was done, I don't know that for sure, but I mean, the design of it was, again, it was a reminder of what the Messiah was coming to do. And so it would be something that everybody in the community would be wanting to have happen. If not, there are other sacrifices we're not talking about here. You know, the Passover celebration culminated with a massive sacrifice that cleansed the entire nation of sin. There are other things involved here. These were the main ones involved with individuals themselves bringing the sacrifice, not the nation as a whole. Now, when we do get to the wealthy unwealthy part of it, that's going into the next part of the actual sacrifice offering system. And this is where we're going to potentially start to get people a little bit upset with us, because we are finally at the part of actually talking about tithing. It's referred to as Masar or Masara, and it literally means a tenth, a part. A tithe is a tenth. We see this throughout the Old Testament. It's the first time we see it. We don't really have specifics on as far as whether or not Cain and Abel gave a tenth or gave the first tenth or not. But we definitely see it in Genesis 14 when Abram gives Melchizedek a tenth of the plunder. It gets more specific in Leviticus 27 because this is where we actually get the command for it. And in Leviticus 27, it is a good command. It's one of those ones that God has labeled, this is good to do. And at that point, it's you give 10% of your best. And then if you want to give more, you're supposed to give a tzedekah, which if those of you that listen to our biblical justice one with Joash, then that should be somewhat familiar because it means righteousness and justice for the oppressed.
Mm.
And that is an extra 5% on top of the 10. So a tithe in Leviticus 27 is not just 10%, it's actually 15. 10% is what God has said, this is what you should do. But what you really should do if you want to be considered righteous is actually 15. And that 10% goes to the community. That 5% goes to the most afflicted within your community. And so there were specific purposes for that 15%.
Would the priest typically dictate to that 5%?
Say that again.
I said, would the priest typically dictate that 5%?
Yeah, the priests were the ones that were supposed to actually take care of where the money was going if the money was given to the priests. But part of what we'll see is that it doesn't necessarily say the money is supposed to go to the priests. And that is what we are going to look at here more specifically in Deuteronomy 14. And so we're going to look at Deuteronomy 14 and we're going to start in verse 22.
Yeah, it says starting in verse 22, each year you are to set aside a tenth of all the produce grown in your fields. You are to eat a tenth of your grain, new wine, and oil, and the firstborn of your herd and flock, in the presence of Yahweh your God at the place where he chooses to have his name dwell, so that you will always learn to fear the Lord your God. But if the distance is too great for you to carry it, since the place where Yahweh your God chooses to put his name is too far away from you, and since the Lord your God has blessed you, then exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place the Lord your God chooses. You may spend the money on anything you want: cattle, sheep, wine, beer, or anything you desire. You are to feast there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice in your family. Do not neglect the Levite within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance among you. At the end of every 3 years, bring a tenth of all your produce for the year and store it within your gates. Then the Levite, who has no portion or inheritance among you, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow within your gates, may come, eat, and be satisfied. And the Lord your God will bless you in all the works of your hands that you do.
All right, so a couple of things here that we see. The first part is that the tithe was not something that was an every week thing. It was every third year, you take a tenth of your produce and a tenth of your grain and wine and oil and the firstborn from your herds and your flocks, and you go to the temple and you have a picnic. With everybody else, it's a big picnic. And then if you can't carry it all because it's too far away, you sell everything and you take the money and then you just go to the place and you buy whatever you're wanting to eat. Doesn't specify what, says whatever you want to eat. This is a big celebration of what God has done for you. And then after that, and then it also says that with all of this, you need to make sure that you give some to the Levites, because the Levites have no fields. They have no inheritance among the tribes.
Mm-hmm.
So take care of them. Feed them, clothe them, make sure they've got what they need. Let them in on the party. And then after that, you take a tenth of everything else that year and you store it in the city so that the Levites, the foreigners, the orphans, the widows have a place to go to come and eat, and not just eat, but to be satisfied. And if you do that, the Lord will bless you in everything that you do. That's not what we talk about when we talk about tithing.
No, not at all. But like you said,
Not at
we're
all.
in Western Christianity, we're just used to the weekly tithing of typically just money. And if you think about this process, waiting a whole third of the year, or every 3 years, excuse me.
3 years, yeah.
Yeah. That almost makes it more challenging, especially if you were storing up produce.
Right.
I can barely keep it in our fridge for a couple weeks, let alone, all right, you're trying to keep produce for 3 years.
Well, and some of that you can see, the firstborns, obviously it's every year. The produce, it says from that year. You're just taking the first fruits that you have and taking it. It's the best of the bunch, you take it. All of that is what is actually commanded. Deuteronomy 26, we see the same sort of thing. It's the tithe years. You take the first fruits and the tithes, and you do so that the Levites, the foreigners, the widows, they will eat and be filled within your gates. It's about community. It's about everybody being taken care of. But like you said, we only want to focus on money most of the time here in our Western mindset. And normally there's one verse in particular that is used to talk about tithing. And that's the next verse we're going to look at, which is Malachi 3, verse 10. Brandon, do you know what it is without looking?
I do not.
Bring the full tithe into the storehouse. And God says, test me on this and see if I will not bless you. And that is where we have full tithe, which we understand is actually 15%, not 10. That's why he says the full tithe. This is both the Masar and the Tzedeki. Bring them both into the storehouse. But we just talked about what the storehouse actually is. The storehouse is not the money pot. The storehouse is a literal storehouse for the community to be able to be not just eat, but be satisfied. That is a completely different understanding than anything that we see within our churches today. Within the Old Testament, offerings were given with a specific purpose in relation to their relationship with God, because it was either to reconcile sin, to thank him for blessing, or as an offering to give back to the people that are serving him, the priests. And it was used specifically to care for the priests, the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the immigrants. Now, in the New Testament, things get a little bit different, because you don't find the word tithe in the New Testament at all. The closest you get is in Mark 12, when Jesus, in response to should we pay taxes, says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but give to God what is God's. That's the closest thing we get to a call for a tithe. So the question then is, why do we focus so much on tithes and offerings if it's not in the New Testament? And instead, what does New Testament giving actually look like? And that is what we are going to discuss right after this break.
We'll be right back.
Today's a great day to start your own podcast. Whether you're looking for a new marketing channel, have a message you want to share with the world, or just think it would be fun to have your own talk show, podcasting is an easy, inexpensive, and fun way to expand your online reach.
Buzzsprout is hands down the easiest and best way to launch, promote, and track your podcast. Your show can be online listened on all major platforms within minutes of finishing your first recording. We just switched to Buzzsprout for Season 2 and have immediately noticed the difference.
With Buzzsprout, you get a great-looking podcast website, audio players that you can drop into your websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and more. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners, and Buzzsprout and the Misfits want to help you get started.
Contact us for a free consultation call, and then visit our affiliate link to get started with Buzzsprout. Using this link not only helps support the Misfits, but it also gets you a $20 Amazon gift card. The teams at Buzzsprout and Ministry Misfits are passionate about helping you succeed. Join over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. To find out more, go to www.ministrymisfits.com/affiliates.
We're back.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Andrew and I are separated, unfortunately, today. We made it a whole whopping 2 episodes before having to be separated in the studio.
1.5, although you weren't even with me for the half, so.
That's true. Good point. And today we were talking about everybody's favorite thing to talk about, which is money. And
Yes,
within
and
that...
specifically getting rid of your money, because that's what really everybody wants to talk about.
Yes, we've been talking about tithing so far, and we started off with our poll question and how people had originally heard it talked about within the churches, and predominantly tithes and offerings won our poll by 66%, followed by cheerful giving at 27%, gifts at 5%. And at the bottom down there, we had donations at 2%, like our milk. And then we went through the Old Testament biblical giving and talked about the different types of sacrifices and offerings that would have typically been given and their purpose behind each one, both to God and the priests, and what that would have looked like for a sin atonement as well. And then right before break, we were in Deuteronomy, both chapter 14 and 26, talking about specifically where the word tithe comes from and how we see that a full tithe is not only 10%, but actually 15%, and what that looks like as far as bringing your, not just money, but first born as far as like cattle and other different things to provide for everyone within the community.
Yeah, it was much different than what we normally talk about when we talk about this stuff. Because, tithe means tenth, and so that means that we have a nice round number, and so it's easy for us to talk about. That's not what it talks about. And it gets even more complicated when we actually realize that tithing has nothing to do with the New Testament church. Because we don't see it anywhere in the New Testament. And so we are asking the question then, what does biblical giving actually look like for a New Testament believer? And what it actually looks like is not 10% or 15%. It's 100% of everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Because this is what we actually see in the New Testament. Christ himself calls of his disciples to give 100% of their finances. That's what we see in Mark chapter 10. This is the rich young ruler who asked Jesus, "What must I do to follow after you?" And Jesus tells him, "Sell everything and give it to the poor, and then you can come follow me." And he can't do it, and he walks away. Jesus calls for us to give 100% of our families. This is what we see in Luke 14. Jesus tells us, if you don't hate your father and mother, you can't be my disciple.
Yeah. And I know we'll get into it a little bit, but I think the challenging part within this is what is 100%, because again, a lot of us get stuck on just the money side there in Mark 10 and say, okay, does this mean then I do need to sell my house, my car, and everything and give it to the poor? Like, what is a true 100%, which I know we'll get into, but I think that's where people typically get caught up, and so they almost just feel defeated, and so 10% feels good enough.
Good enough. And that is the thing that is going to keep coming back a lot, is this idea of it's good enough. But let's keep going, because Jesus isn't done requiring things of us. Jesus calls for 100% of our careers. This is what we see in Matthew 4 and a lot of other places throughout the gospel. When Jesus calls James and John and Peter and Andrew from the boats, he tells them to put their nets down and follow after him. That's a complete career change on their behalf. And John, when we hear about what we have with John the elder, John the beloved, he was already following after somebody. He already was a disciple of John the Baptist, and he had to drop that completely to go after Jesus. Matthew was a tax collector that had to give up everything. His allegiance to Rome, his allegiance to money, his allegiance to the systems, all of it to follow after Christ. Because he calls for 100% of our careers. He calls for 100% of our insecurities. This is a fun one.
Everyone
this
is like the one where we talked about with the sin, or realized or unrealized, your insecurities.
Yes. This is John chapter 4, right? Jesus makes the woman walk through every insecure detail of her life with him. But in doing so, that's why she understands that this guy is worth following. But he calls for us to recognize who we are before we can even start talking to him about who he is. He calls for 100% of our reputation. This is what we see in John chapter 9 with the man that's born blind. And this is something I don't know why we don't hear about it more. But in John chapter 9, this is the story of the blind man. And when we watch the story of the blind man, what we actually are watching is we have somebody that was an outcast of society because he was blind. Even the disciples are like, who sinned, this guy or his parents? Sin was the mark on him. His blindness was the mark. Jesus heals him. And before the guy can even get his name, Jesus tells him to go present himself to the priest. He goes and presents himself to the priest. Now he's back in society again. And when they ask him who did this, the guy has no idea. And it's like, I think it was just some rabbi. And so they go and get the guy's parents because, there's no way this guy was actually blind. And the parents disown him. He finally is able to be reunited with his family, and his parents disown him because he's now saying this guy is a prophet. And then the people give him one more chance to recount this idea that he was just healed. And he calls him, he says, do you want to follow after him as well? He's now committed to following this guy as a disciple. And he's thrown out of the assembly again. He had just been reunited, and now he got himself thrown out again. But he does so to find Jesus. And when he finds Jesus, now it is, you are the Messiah. We watched this guy go through the full process in 24 hours of seeing Jesus as some teacher to some prophet to some guy that I should follow to the Messiah.
Yeah, like
and he's
in the
willing
story,
to sacrifice everything to get to that point.
Yeah, just like in the story of he's basically like, you're not listening. I've told you this before.
Right. I've told you this. Why do we have to keep going over this?
He's like, I was blind and now I can see. What else more do I need to tell you? They don't believe him.
And that is why Jesus calls for us to give up our reputation 100%. Because we are blind and now we can see. And then Jesus also calls for us to give 100% of our lives. This is Matthew 16. This is the idea of take up your cross and follow me. Because it's not about us. It's about him. Now, this idea of 100%, like you said, people are going to be like, well, what is 100%? But that's not the only objection that we're going to get. We'll get to the what is 100% here in a minute, because that's actually a useful question. That's something we need to actually understand. But we need to address the common objections to this idea of Christ calling us to 100%, because we hear this quite a bit. Because none of these things are something that we want to actually give up 100% of.
No, and I think in anything else, if somebody tells you, all right, Andrew, get a 10% or 15% on this test, you're like, all right, that's pretty easy. But if you have to get 100% or if you're about to run a race, all right, only run at 10% like you want to. Like it almost seems easy in a way, even though we
Right.
know it's not. But
Right.
to give 100% is a true commitment.
And that's just talking even finances when we're
Mm-hmm.
talking that side of it, people object. But then when we start adding in the idea of, no, you've got to give up everything to follow after him, then the idea of 100% gets even bigger. I'm sure there's a mathematician somewhere that's like, it's 100%, so it can't get bigger. But it gets bigger with Misfits. So
And
these are the
Jesus.
common objections to it. The first one that we hear oftentimes is the idea of that the call for 100%, especially of finances, is where this one gets thrown around, was just a conditional thing to the rich young ruler, and God does not expect us to do that. But there's a problem with this. Because what do we actually see of the church in Acts chapter 4 and chapter 5? Brandon, do you know off the top of your head what's going on in Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 5?
Is it deceiving of the Holy Spirit?
That's chapter 5
Okay.
with Ananias and Sapphira. But what was it that Ananias and Sapphira did?
I don't remember.
They sold a piece of property, and when Peter came to collect, because it was supposed to go to the church, Peter asked, is this all of it? And they said no. And Peter said, are you sure? And they said no. Peter said, you've lied to the Holy Spirit. Boom, they're gone. What that
Final
story is
answer.
not saying is that if you don't give 100%, you will be struck down. Because that was not the point of the story, and that is not what the point of this is, bringing up Acts chapter 5. What we see in Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 5 is that the church had become a community. And so that no one considered anything to be their own. And so they would sell their property and bring the money and lay it at the feet of the disciples, and it was distributed as was needed. And so everyone was taken care of within the community, not just within the Christian community, within the community. The early church took the idea of sell what you have and give to the poor literally. So obviously this was not a call just to the rich young ruler. This was a
Yeah.
call
Now,
to be a disciple.
do you think it's challenging within the church now that for some we don't always see where, again, specifically the finances, where that's going to the end person?
That's the next thing on the list, Brandon. How about that? One of the
I wasn't
objections
trying
we
to.
hear, one of the objections we hear is this idea of the fact that I don't know where my money is being spent. I can't trust the church. Two different versions of the same situation. One of them is a major issue, but not an issue related to the finances. If you don't trust your church, we've got other issues that we need to talk about. If you can't trust your church, you need to ask, why are you still a member of that community? Wholesale, not just because of finances. Tithing is the least of the concern there. You need to ask, why do you not trust your church? And why are you still staying there? That's not what we're talking about here. The other question that comes up though is, well, how do I know that my money is going to something that I actually support? Which again is saying you don't actually trust your church. But the bigger question is that you're saying it is still your money after you have given it. The point of giving to the ministry or giving to God is that you are giving back. Right? That's what we saw in the Old Testament. It was about drawing us closer to God. we'll get into this in a little bit as far as the transparent need for transparency within churches. That's a big issue. But if you are still saying that after you have given the money, it is still your money, and so you should decide where it goes, what was the reason you actually gave it?
Which is kind of funny because again, now there's lots of places within offering that you can dictate
Right.
where you want your
Designating funds, like, like what we have within Third Street is that, we're able to give to Third Street, we're able to give to Martin Center, or we can give to Tithe. All within the same offering plate. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the idea of, well, I'll use an example that I have dealt with within ministry. Why does the youth budget get this amount when all they are doing is buying pop for the kids and not charging them? My hard-earned tithe money shouldn't be going to that. That's completely different than saying I want 10% of what I'm giving to go to Tithe, 20% to go to the Martin Center, and then 70% to stay within the Third Street budget. That's doing what we see within the Old Testament model, right? 10% goes to the community, 5% goes to the extra programs. That's different than having a problem with, I don't want to give to the benevolent fund because people that I don't agree with their lifestyle might get some money.
That's laugh, but it's true, unfortunately, yeah.
And that's a heart issue. That's not an issue with the church getting your money. That's a heart issue of the fact that you have not even given the money. You are wanting to feel better about yourself. That's not an offering. You still want to be in control. Right, yeah, it's control. That's not an offering. That's definitely not a sacrifice. It's just a different motivation to try to feel like you have power. One of the other big ones that we get all the time is that this is just Marxism, right? It's just Marxism. 100% of everything. I have no personal property. This is all just Marxism. Big problem with that. Jesus was 1800 years before Marx. Don't think Jesus was commanding Marxism.
No.
Second big problem with that is, who cares if it is Marxism today?
Yeah, because the other thing going back to is, whose money is it anyways?
Right. It's not our money. We didn't read the verse, but in Psalms, God is the one that owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. It's all his anyway. We're just giving it back.
Yeah.
And so whether or not that matches your preferred economic system of today doesn't make a difference. And this goes into the Cold War theology, the capitalist Christianity stuff of the fact that capitalism is not a biblical model. Marxism is also not a biblical model. Those things are separate from what we are talking about here, because what we are talking about here is that we are taking the blessings that God has given us and giving them back to him and letting him dictate how he uses us and our finances and our families and our careers and our problems and our platforms and our entire life. That is what we are talking about. There is no economic system that's going to fit that. And if it looks like one that you don't like, get over it. That's the nicest way to say it.
That'll be the next t-shirt there. If you don't like it, get over it.
And honestly, that's part of what we're talking about, right? You were supposed to be giving our insecurities over to God. If we are insecure about the way we feel about our money, in terms of the fact that we think we are now doing some kind of economic system that goes against our Americanness, that's all the more reason we should be giving it to God.
Yeah, because it's not something that's taught in finance classes. Like, it's countercultural. And I know that we're bad at math, but kingdom
Yes.
math works out even differently. Of
Yes. Maybe
again, we
that's why
see it.
I'm bad at math, is that I've always been taught in ministry to do kingdom math. Maybe that's the issue right there. This
That's
is
what it
all
was.
on you, Dr. Linville and Dr. Quigley.
But we see from in Deuteronomy of how like God will bless the giving, and we'll take care of everybody as well. Again, when we step out of the way to get out of control, God is already in control. He just wants our full love and praise and 100%.
And that's not prosperity gospel.
Mm-mm.
Because what did we see in Deuteronomy? Why is it that God is going to bless the community? Because the community is going to be actually caring for itself and loving on each other. That's why the community will be blessed, is because of the fact that God has already provided them with the resources to survive, and not just survive, to prosper. And when nobody is holding back, selfishly thinking about their own, we talked about this when what we read in Philippians, the idea of your God is your stomach. I have always looked at that as Paul's talking literal here. Your God is your stomach. Of you want to feel fulfilled at all times, regardless of how anybody else is feeling, which is
And
the
with that,
opposite of the call of Christ.
yeah, and with that, you think about how quickly you get hungry. Like
Right.
it's
You
a
can't stay
constant
filled.
fill. Yeah.
But what we see is that when we follow this plan that God has already laid out, we will be able to be filled. And not just physically, but spiritually as well. And now the other objection to this idea is that we are disregarding the Old Testament. The idea that we're saying 100 instead of 10 is the disregarding of the Old Testament. But we just talked about the fact that this is actually following what we see in the Old Testament. But it's understanding that we are called to be disciples of Christ, not just a community that is under the law. This
Hmm.
goes back into our Galatians study a little bit as well. 10% was enough to care for the community, or 15%, sorry, was enough to care for the community and to care for everybody that needed taken care of. So if 15% was enough, 100% is enough that everybody will be taken care of as well. We don't have to worry about it. And now we understand the fact that we are giving 100% because God has already given 100% of himself for us as well.
I think one of the other objections too that we didn't specifically have outlined was what about them over there? What
Right.
about I'm giving, but now somebody else gets, well, I guess it's kind of within the Marxism aspect,
Right.
but somebody else gets to benefit
Yes.
while
They
I
didn't they haven't worked hard enough for this.
correct. They haven't earned this. Or I've seen how they live. So there
Right.
should be a list of things that they need to do to earn money or whatever. I shouldn't even say money, but just whatever their basic
Resourcing.
needs are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, that does get into the next thing though, as far as the in a New Testament giving, what actually should the money be used for? Because again, unless your church has a food pantry, bringing 10% of your produce is not going to go well because the church is not going to have anywhere to store it. You know, bringing them all that kind of stuff is not going to help unless you have ministries that do that. Within Third Street, we just started an actual like closet. We've had food and stuff going on there every night, basically, whenever there's something going on. So bringing food to our church is helpful and requested a lot because we like to eat. Bringing clothing is very helpful because we have a lot of people within our community that need access to affordable or even free clothing. But if your church doesn't have those sort of things, money is the main option that you have to give. So, what is the offerings, the tithes, supposed to actually go to within a New Testament construct? The first thing that it is supposed to go to is to care for your ministry leaders, your pastors, your elders. This is something that for some reason is still controversial. But pastors have bills to pay. They have kids that need diapers and food. They are sacrificing, giving 100% of their career to God and to you as people that they are shepherding. They deserve to be taken care of. We see this in 1 Corinthians 9 and in 2 Corinthians 9. Of the idea of you need to care for those that are caring for your souls. That is a biblical construct, not a thing that is just done by greedy swindlers wanting to sell the gospel. You need to be caring for your pastors, because this is another truth that unless you are in ministry, you will not understand. There is no such thing as part-time ministry. Bivocational ministers are actually full-time ministers with another job on top of it. And then if they're parents, they have another job on top of that. We need to make sure that we are caring for our pastors. Now, are there pastors that will abuse this? Absolutely. But that's why the church is supposed to call your pastors accountable for what they are doing as ministers of the gospel.
And again, it goes back to what we talked about of the giving 100%. Are you giving 100% of your reputation, your career?
Right.
Maybe you're holding on to that because, okay, I've got this and I can get more. I can ask for more.
Take care of the people that are taking care of you. The next thing that we've got is that it is supposed to go to care for our communities. And that is not just the people within the walls, but outside the walls as well. Those are two communities that are supposed to be intertwined together. Yes, we need to make sure that we take care of those within our own walls. Bearing each other's burdens, weeping with those who weep, mourning with those who mourn, all those sort of things. We as a church should be able to help those within our church when crisis hits. But we also should be able to care for our communities when crisis hits. Both of those things need to be true, and both of those things should be happening within our churches. This is what loving our neighbor looks like, because sometimes loving our neighbor literally means the house across the street from us. It sometimes is a literal neighbor. That is part of where this is supposed to go. We see this again. We saw this in Acts chapter 4. Nobody within the community had any needs because everybody in the community did not consider property their own. We also see this in Mark chapter 10, which again is where Jesus tells the rich young ruler to sell everything he has and give it to the poor. And then he can become a disciple. These are biblical mandates to take care of our community, whether that's a community of believers or a community of the people that we are called to serve that is within our church's range. And the other place it's supposed to go is actually to fund our ministries. Shocker, right? We should actually be able to fund the ministries that we have within our churches. We see this in Philippians 4 and in Matthew 10. Philippians 4, Paul thanks the Philippian church for being such generous givers to him. Whenever he has had need arise within his ministry, he writes a letter and they send a check. Not a real check, because I understand it's, He had that support system in Philippians where when his ministry had a problem, they filled it. And more than filled it most of the time is what he talks about. We also see this in Matthew 10. Jesus tells the disciples when he sends them out that if they have a need, they just need to ask for it. And if somebody gives it to them, bless the house. If they don't, you move on to the next house. The ministry should be able to be funded through biblical giving because the money is not ours. The money is God's. And if we are saying that we are giving 100% of ourselves, when somebody comes and says, hey, can you support me in this? This is another opportunity to do that. Because not only are you giving the money to somebody that is in need, but now you are invested in this other person's ministry of giving them 100% of themselves.
So, as somebody that has been pastor of a churches, how does this typically get divided? Is it a budget with the elders that gets decided what
So it
percentage goes
depends on your
where?
church. And this is
Okay.
something where, again, we did say, and I'm very clear about this, transparency is necessary within our churches. If your church is not willing to share the budget, that's a red flag. Because again, the money is not ours. The money does not belong to the church. The money belongs to God. So why are we not willing to show what the money is going to? Now, that doesn't mean that you get to know why the family next to you received a check last week out of the benevolent fund. You don't need to know their business. Trust that the elders are seeking after what God is telling them to do. But it does mean that if the church is saying, oh, we need money for this new roof, and you've donated a ton of money, and they're still saying, oh, we don't have enough for the roof, even though you've met the goal, that they should be able to tell you why you have not met the goal.
Mm-hmm.
Transparency is necessary. If you can't ask your elder board or your finance board or whoever to see a copy of the financial records, not the giving records, the financial records. Because again, I've been through this enough to know the difference and to know what people actually are asking. If somebody is asking to see somebody's giving records, they want to know what this person is making. If you ask me to see the financial records of the church, our budget, then you should be able to look and see, oh wow, why are we paying this much in water every month? And
Mm-hmm.
that's a good thing because we're baptizing a lot of people, right? That's the
Yeah.
sort of thing that we can have those kind of conversations. But we do not need to know where every dime and penny is going just so that we can feel like we have control over the situation. And now the other side of this, and this again is something that leads us into the last point of all of this, as far as what do we do if it's not 100? What if it's not 100%? If you are going to your finance board because you don't like where the money is going, or because you are afraid that the church is about to bankrupt themselves because they spend so much money on these different programs that you don't see the benefit of, ask this question. If the church goes bankrupt and only reaches one person for Christ, there's one disciple that comes out of however big of a budget you're talking, was the money well spent?
Hmm.
And the argument that always comes back is, well, that's not being a good steward. But that's not what I
Mm-hmm.
asked. I asked was it worth it? Not should we do it, was it worth it? Because what that shows is, again, we're back to the intentions of our heart in all of this. One person is worth however much money we have to put into it.
Yeah.
That's the entire point of all of the parables within Luke 15. After Jesus has already talked about disowning your family, he then talks about the fact, he'll leave the 99 behind for one.
Mm-hmm.
The woman will search her whole house to find one coin. One is worth X amount of dollars. And when I say X amount of dollars, I'm not saying put a dollar amount on the person. I'm saying that it is a unqualified variable. See,
Yeah,
I do know some math terms.
and I think that's also the commitment for us with discipleship too.
Yes,
Uh,
100%.
it's
Yes.
yes, it's not this. Okay, I spent 10 hours with Andrew, so now I need to. That's it. That's all he gets of me.
Although you do say that most weeks, but
True.
you know that that is part of it as well. Because again, what are we called to? It's 100% of everything, including our time and our person as a whole. 100% of us goes to Christ. That
Hmm.
is what He has asked for. To be a disciple, it's 100%. And again, we see this again in 2 Corinthians 9 with the verse that normally is used not necessarily in a good way related to tithes and offerings, of the idea of the Lord loves a cheerful giver. It's about us we are wanting to give it all. Even if we can't give it all, we want to be able to give it all. It's about our heart. The number is not the important thing here. It's about our heart behind all of it.
Yeah, even we see coming off of Easter of the woman that pours the perfume
Right.
on Jesus's hair, and I think they said it would be 300, basically 300 days' wages worth. And one, the disciples are one of them. I don't know if we get to
Judas
see.
specifically. Yeah.
Okay, I was like, I don't know if we specifically know. I mean, it makes sense with him being the money guy. Was like, what are you doing? Do you know how much this is worth? And Jesus is just so happy of what she gave, especially as that would have been more of a burial um,
Right.
ritual. Yeah, and so
It's
she gave everything.
And right there is again what we see with some of our objections to this, of where, well, that money should have gone here.
Hmm.
But that money went directly towards worship of the Messiah. It was well spent. Even
Yeah.
if the people around didn't agree that it was well spent or did not see the benefit behind it. It's about the heart.
Hmm.
Biblical giving is an act of worship. Biblical giving is an act of discipleship. It's not about the amount on a check or the amount of hours that you spend volunteering or the amount of food that you've brought to the food pantry or this. It's not a checklist. It's an act of worship to the Messiah that you are following after. That is what biblical giving looks like. And so when you hear somebody say, you don't have to give 10%, you don't even have to write a check, you can still come. They're not denying the scriptures. They're putting out a call for discipleship.
Hmm.
Because 100% of the person that day may not be financial that needs to be given away. It may be an insecurity. It may be something regarding family. It may be just straight up pride. You don't necessarily know what a person is actually laying down at the foot of the cross on any given day. And the better part of that is we don't need to know.
Yeah.
Which again, going back to the transparency thing, pastors, you don't need to know who's giving anything. All you need to know, if you are from the business side of things, is, do we have enough to pay the electric bill this week? Okay. That's literally all you really need to know. You don't need to know who's giving, because it's not about the amount, it's about the heart. And it's not about us that's collecting the money. It's about what that money is going towards, which is the kingdom and not our own personal ones. So this is a heavy topic.
Yeah, I can't
That
wait to
we
hear the
don't.
responses back from this.
Yes, I'm sure we will hear plenty of responses back from this. Let us know what you think. Let us know if you think that we're still completely off our rockers. Let us know if you still think we're Marxists, even though we just told you Jesus said all this 1,800 years before Marx was even born. Let us know what's going on. You can do that through all the social media channels. It's at Ministry Misfit, no S. You can do that at the website where you can leave a comment there. That's ministrymisfits.com. If you want to support financially, you can do that a couple of different ways. One is through buying Misfits merch on our website. That's the shop link. It gets you all the different stuff. There's also affiliate links, including Giving Bean Coffee, where we get, I believe, 25% of your purchases there. Or you can do so at patreon.com/Ministry Misfits, which is a monthly support, and it also gets you access to some exclusive things, including our Bible study, walking through the book of Galatians, which we are almost done with. Almost, kind of.
Yeah, I was
Maybe
hoping
not.
you were going to have a Patreon link where we could get food or something, like part of people's cooking or something. They could bring it over to us, but
Well, if you're local and you want to provide us with food, just hit us up on social media. We won't turn that down either. So, in the meantime, if you missed the Holy Week special that we did with Buddy Walk, go back and check out that. Joe and I dive somewhat deep, but not too deep into all of that different stuff. Again, be looking on the website for some of the updated resources, updated portals, things like that. Potentially, maybe, maybe there might be a new blog coming up here soon, depending on if I ever remember to write it or not. As well as we've got some new merch that will be coming out as soon as our shipping company lets me upload the pictures. So, Brandon, hopefully next week we'll be healthy enough to be back.
yes.
The bug has left. We got it out in the middle of one of the breaks. So if you were wondering if the bee was still here, it's gone.
And it wasn't a bee,
We
it was
got
a
a-
stink bug.
Yes, and it turned out to be a stink bug, not a bee. So we dodged that bullet. So we'll see you all next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/Ministry Misfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Ministry Misfits.